So hopefully we can make today's session as interactive as possible. I know a lot of folks on the call are the 101 point of building RAG applications, and many are already using Braintrust. So I'll skip a bunch of the kind of like overly repetitive basic stuff and talk about a few fun things, show you a demo, and then would love to, again, make this as interactive as possible and do some fun Q&A. Just a little bit of background about me. Prior to Braintrust, I used to lead the AI team at Figma. And before that, I started a company in the prehistoric, pre-ChatGPT days of AI called Impera. Jason was also working on ML in the prehistoric era at Stitch Fix, which was one of our customers. And we built AI software that extracted data from documents. And at both companies, we ran into a lot of issues where we would change something about our models or prompts or the data that we used and break a bunch of stuff. And we had to get really good at doing evals to help make sure that didn't happen. And so we built internal tools to help us do that. And then, of course, it was really hard to find data to actually do those evals. So we built more internal tools to find data from our observability pipelines, and that eventually became the basis for Braintrust. A little bit about RAG, and in particular, I'm going to show you what we think is like the easiest possible way to create and evaluate a basic RAG agent. But I think like one simple way of framing RAG is just an LLM with a retrieval tool. And it's convenient because it allows you to like localize the RAG logic into a tool. Tools are quite powerful in and of themselves. And it also makes them very easy and composable to test and use in other applications. So we're going to like, for the context of this presentation, assume that this is what one way of doing RAG and what we're going to show. So what I'm going to show today is actually how you can use one of our more advanced features called the playground to actually test RAG. I think a lot of the time you run evals, especially if you come from a data science background, it's your natural inclination, and I have the same inclination, is to run them in code. But it's actually powerful to run them in something like a playground where you can be very interactive at like tweak the system prompt, see the results immediately, run evals, engage non-technical folks to look at the results, label data, etc. And so we're actually going to show you how to do RAG evals in our playground. So one important part of this is retrieval. And in Braintrust, this is TypeScript, by the way, but in Braintrust, you can define tools in both TypeScript and Python, and you can call external services. In this case, we're going to call the OpenAI Embeddings API and Pinecone as a vector database. And you can wrap this up and then actually run a simple command, npx braintrust push or braintrust push in Python, and publish this into the UI. And I'll show you this right now, actually. When you do that, you get something in Braintrust in the tools section that is exactly that, and you can actually play with it. So you could say, this is RAG over our data sets. I could say, our docs, sorry, how do I create an eval? And I could say top K is 3, and actually just run it. And this will run this code, but it's running behind the scenes, not in your own notebook or on your laptop. Back to this. You can also define prompts in Braintrust, and those prompts can actually reference the tools. And when you do that, you just, again, run the same Braintrust push thing, and you get a tool, a prompt that actually references the tool. Here's the prompt, takes a question, and you'll notice it's actually hooked into that tool. And so now I can say, how do I create an eval? And it will actually not only run the prompt, but run the tool, pass the tool results back to the prompt, and then return a result. Now, the really neat thing is how you can use this to do evals. And the first question is like, why should you run evals in the first place? Hopefully this doesn't require too much convincing. I know Jason is really big on evals, but the first thing is that in RAG, you can have like very unpredictable error modalities, including repetitive loops, hallucinations, and so on. And the other thing that's RAG specific is that you're involving a third-party system, retrieval system, and that can have its own type of failures. And so it's useful to actually test both of these things. I also think it's useful to test both quantitative and qualitative metrics. Qualitative metrics are sometimes called vibe metrics, but quantitative metrics are things that you can very clearly quantify and test. For example, if you have ground truth values for retrieval or for the final answer, you can actually just test accuracy. Obviously, that's not always the case. You can also test quantitative metrics like cost or latency. I think in RAG, latency can be a big problem, and so it's quite useful to actually check the latency trade-off as you're making changes to your application. But I actually think it's equally important to test qualitative metrics as well. People really hate AI applications that are repetitive. Maybe they have the answer correct, but they're totally painful to actually look at. And so I think it's like equally important to actually characterize what you want out of an answer and actually try to define the right user experience that you want coming out of your application and try to evaluate that as well. And the last kind of high level thing on evals I'll say is that I think the lazy approach is really powerful. And by that, what I mean is one of the biggest failure modes that we see from customers is doing like, how could I possibly evaluate this thing? Let me set up everything. Let me evaluate every possible step. Let me ask Jason to write every possible question he'll ever ask my system. And until I do all that stuff, I'm not going to do any evals because what's the point? The reality is that I think evals are just as much of a process workflow and structuring your development process thing as they are a quantitative measure. And subscribing to the workflow of evals will help you iterate a lot faster. And so we recommend a very simple approach, which is the simplest thing to do if you're building a RAG bot is to actually just use your application, maybe plug it into something like Braintrust to capture the inputs and outputs and log them, and then save some good examples and evaluate the original input against the final output. And then as you actually change things and things break, try to find failure points and then run like more specific evals. So you might, for example, change one of the prompts or add a new question and notice that the retrieval is broken and that's why the final answer is incorrect. And when you notice that, you might as well save that specific example in a retrieval data set and then start to actually optimize the retrieval from there versus trying to think about all of this stuff ahead of time. Now, I'll show you this in Braintrust in a second, but there's two kinds of scorers that you might want to invest in. One is code-based, and the other is LLM as a judge. There are some very spicy opinions on Twitter and whatnot about these two different methods. And I think they have trade-offs like anything in AI or in software engineering. And I think the best teams are really good at actually leveraging both. And I would say at a high level, code-based scorers are often better at the more quantitative things that you might want to measure. And LLM as a judge is generally better at subjective stuff. And we see the best teams that we work with generally rely on heuristics as the North Star measurement of whether their application is working or not broken. And then they use LLM as a judge metrics as a way to provide additional context and help them look at the examples with their eyeballs that are probably the most useful to look at. To give you an example, if you're someone like Zapier or Notion, you're running at very large scale, you might have tens of thousands or more test cases in your evals. You don't always want to manually scan. Let's say you run an eval and you break like 2,000 of them. You don't want to necessarily scan all 2,000 of them. But if you use an LLM as a judge to help you understand maybe why some of the examples broke, you could potentially look at much fewer. So let me switch over here, and we're actually going to jump into the playground. Now, I'll just emphasize that everything I'm doing here, you can also do in a notebook, but for a lot of reasons, I think there's some benefits to doing this in a UI like a playground. I've actually just plugged in that prompt that we were playing with earlier, and if I hit run, it will run the prompt. And you'll notice the results are not very good. The scores are not very high. And I think that's because we didn't include this tool. So now let me actually try including the tool and let's see how it impacts these scores. Sorry, there's an intermittent error, as I referred to earlier, that can sometimes happen. Luckily, we can just run this example again in a moment. Amazing. And so this gives you an example of what it's like to actually evaluate something in a more interactive way directly in a UI like this. And again, I'm not saying you necessarily need to do it this way, but I do think that there are a number of benefits to being able to iterate this quickly. And we've actually seen a lot of our customers, including some of the most technical users at our customers, move towards this style of evaluation. I won't bore you with a bunch of more demo propaganda stuff, but you can do some really interesting things like duplicate a prompt and then try try tweaking the system prompt and actually compare things side by side. And so it's a very powerful way to actually iterate on stuff. And you can even do it if you're doing RAG.
Sorry, I might have missed this. What is the metrics, like the context inclusion, factuality coming from?
Great question. So these are actually three scores that I've defined within this project. So factuality is a pre-built score that's actually part of our auto evals library, and it is just a prompt that was created originally by OpenAI, and it takes an input, expected value, an output, and then it asks an LLM to grade it with 5 criteria. And then it maps those criteria to a score between 0 and 1. The other two are actually scores that we created specifically for this project. So if I look at context inclusion, this is actually a JavaScript function. And this JavaScript function is trying to figure out whether the context keywords are in the output. So this is a heuristic that's basically testing that. You can actually tweak this again in the UI, you can play with it, etc. And you can also use it in your code. So if you create it in the UI, you can dynamically run it from your code. And then relevance judge is an LLM. And so this is a very simple prompt. You probably want to make it more complicated and more specific to your use case as you actually iterate on it. That lets you basically ask an LLM whether the output was relevant to the original question.
Oh, David.
Thanks. Is there a best? Sorry, is one of them the best? Are you opinionated on what the greatest metric is to use there?
I actually think that you want to use multiple metrics when you're doing, especially when you're heavy into iteration. And what ends up happening is you end up starting to view one metric as the North Star. For RAG applications, actually, the factuality metric tends to work really well. I'm not 100% sure this is true, but I think because OpenAI uses it, their models are also very good at actually executing the prompt. And so we see a lot of customers actually rely on the factuality metric as the North Star metric for RAG. And what you can do is actually look to say, hey, if factuality is lower on a particular example than it was before, what happened to the other metrics? If factuality is lower, was context inclusion also lower? And if so, maybe the problem had to do with retrieval. If not, maybe it didn't have to do with retrieval. I think at first you slice the problem different ways, and then eventually you start to intuit what the relationship between the metrics is. And as an engineer, you get faster and more efficient at actually using the different metrics together to figure out what the issues are. Jason, do you have a question too?
Yeah, David just wanted to also see if you could show some of the quantitative metrics like the latency, time to first token, etc. I think there
Oh,
were
yeah. Let me see if yeah, let me show you what it looks like. From here, you can actually kick off full experiments in Braintrust, and that will capture like a very wide set of metrics as well. Just because I don't want to screw with the demo gods, I'm not going to run one of those right now, but I've run a bunch of them in the past. And let me show you what they look like for another project. If we click into one of these experiments, you'll see the experiment view. And this, again, was populated from a data set, and you get a bunch of LLM metrics that you can compare at a high level. As soon as O3 came out, I ran an eval of O3 against GPT-4o for one of our use cases, and it was pretty interesting to see that even though O3 generates a lot more output tokens, the cost is so much lower for output tokens than GPT-4o that it still netted out to be cheaper. And so it makes it very easy for you to see stuff like that. You can also click into specific examples. So if you want to see cases that now have more output tokens than they did before, you can actually click into those examples and look at the side-by-side input and output and try to figure out why. You can see here's the difference in output. And of course, you can also see all that information per LLM call. And I think that's super important when you're actually debugging stuff to look at the individual LLM calls and try to play with them.
Yeah, I'll just make one comment before you continue. But yeah, I really love the regressions feature because it just means that across multiple runs, I can just only look at the examples that are performing poorly. I can just like look at 100, think really hard, and usually you can come up with a way of improving the system downstream, whether it's better extraction, better retrieval, or adding a re-ranker. It's pretty great.
Yeah, I used to, back in the Impera days when I first built the hacky version of Braintrust, I had a spreadsheet with a bunch of Snowflake SQL queries saved. And one of them was like a insane join that did the regressions query. And that was the main thing, excuse me, I would use. By the way, when you collect all of these metrics across experiments, you can also do higher level analysis. So for example, if you collect the model name, you can just click a button and then very quickly generate a model leaderboard. Or another thing that Hamel, who's another one of Jason's homies, clued me into was it's actually quite powerful to look at the latency versus quality trade-off with different models and try to understand where there are significant efficiencies or inefficiencies. So for this use case, for example, it actually turns out that O1 preview doesn't perform particularly better, but of course it's much slower. And you can get a very quick visual indication of that by looking at a plot like this.
Are we ready for some questions, or did you have a couple more?
I have just two really quick pointers I wanted to share. The first is that we recently wrote a guide, which I would highly recommend checking out. And it's a companion guide to this Anthropic guide. So I'm sure a bunch of you saw this. Anthropic has like a guide on how to generate or create a bunch of different agent architectures. We wrote one which is very similar, and it follows all of those agentic architectures and then has eval functions you can use for each one. And so I think it's a nice starting point. Of course, you should adapt them to whatever you're doing, but it's a really nice starting point if you're building an agent that sort of maps to one of these architectures. And then the other thing is just, I know we're going to talk about Q&A. I really like this diagram that one of the engineers at Zapier originally made about how they actually what their development process is like and how they think about the feedback loop. So I'm happy to talk about this or anything else that you all are curious about in the Q&A.
Sweet. Let's jump into some of the questions on the Q&A, and then we can leave it up to more open-ended questions.
Awesome.
This is a question I tend to answer a lot for other people, but I really love your answer here, which is, when do I know it's time to just move from something like a Google Sheet or a Python notebook and like a CSV file to using a tool like Braintrust? I think it's probably, there's definitely situations where it's probably too early, but yeah, like when do you think it's the right time? How can you
tell? I would say that there are probably two major reasons that you'd want to move. And to be honest with you, I would encourage you to start by, if you are comfortable writing Python, using notebooks, etc. I think there's a lot of value in actually starting that way, because it's a zero abstraction, nothing left to the imagination way of familiarizing yourself with the problem of running evals and thinking about data. It's a good thing, I think, to do that. The primary reasons that you'd want to move on, maybe I'll come up with three. So the first one maybe is the most obvious, which is when you have enough data, just the physics of navigating a large table in a Jupyter notebook or a large spreadsheet can get unwieldy. And I think for me, at least, the breaking point tends to be around 100. I'm probably a lot worse at pandas and stuff than people on this call. I'm more of a TypeScript and SQL person myself. And so I tend to want to look at the raw data as a table and interact with it directly. And so past around 100 examples, I really start to struggle. Maybe for you, it's lower or maybe it's higher. But at some point, if you start to feel like there's too much data for you to really have a handle on, it's a good idea to move. Another reason is that you might want to collaborate with other folks on the team. And when you do, it's very useful to have long, forever persistent artifacts that you can share with them and play with. So let's say you actually go and run an eval. I think it's really powerful to actually have a link to something like this that you can just share with a colleague, and then you can look at the results together, post it in Slack, take screenshots of individual pieces of it, and it's much easier to reproduce and play with than something that lives ephemerally in a notebook. And then I think the third reason, which is maybe the least obvious, but probably the most significant, is that at some point you're going to want to connect your evals to data that you get from a production system. And I think the most important thing that you can do when you're creating evals is to develop a very good feedback loop from things that happen in production, especially when people have a suboptimal experience with your application, into your evals. And trying to connect the dots between your production observability system, data sets that you can use that are reproducible for evals, and then evals that you run on top of those data sets, that starts to become a very complex soup of scripting and ETL and storing reproducible artifacts and so on. And I think that is for a lot of teams that we work with that are tech companies that would otherwise build software themselves, that is usually the breaking point where they start using Braintrust.
That's great. Yeah, I would also say like one of the big things is in the beginning it's pretty easy to look at these spreadsheets, but like one of the things we did with Zapier is really just get together like every other week, do a screen share over the exact same evals that we see on Braintrust and just having a conversation about what people are asking about, what are the things we need to improve, and we might come to a conclusion that says, oh wow, a lot of the feedback that comes from using the Notion API is degrading. Maybe this is something we can go and do a better data analysis into and figure out. And those have also led to pretty good results. This is a much more pointed question. We are currently using LangFuse right now. Where does Braintrust excel compared to the other options on the market?
Yeah, I'm happy to have a more spirited one-on-one discussion with whoever asked that. As someone who works really hard on Braintrust and respects other people who work really hard on their products, I try not to say negative things about other products. I think that if some of what you've seen or heard today is exciting to you, then you should try Braintrust. There are a lot of people that move from LangFuse to Braintrust when they start to get serious about evals. And I would say that we have significantly more features like UI features, experiment tracking features, and so on around evals in particular. And so if you're running evals and you already have written some code to do that, I would just encourage you to try Braintrust and see if it makes a meaningful impact or you see a meaningful difference. I think you will, but the best way to do it is actually just to try it.
Cool. Next question, feature request anchored live stream using Braintrust. That would actually be pretty cool to just see how you guys are using it internally. But the next question is, are there many companies that are defining human aligned LLMs as a judge? This is something I talked to Hamel a lot about, which is it's one thing that you have a prompt that kind of works. But I'm curious how many people or how many sort of fine-tuned LLMs have you seen that are used for this kind of judging work?
Yeah, I think that is more hype than reality at this point. Like most of the problems that people are trying to evaluate, they do have the answer might be difficult to characterize, but they tend to have a correct answer. And I think one of the challenges with human alignment is that unless you have a really good UI, UX, and workflow that forces you to solicit enough data and keep realigning things, you can use it as a crutch and temporarily overfit what you're aligning to before you actually are forced to solve the underlying problem. So we have experimented with it in our product, and we've also worked with a number of customers who've implemented it using Braintrust and shared results with us and so on. And we are at this stage not convinced that it is a great method. On the flip side, I think that there is a lot of innovation coming with models and the programmability of models. And so I think that some of the physics are going to change over the coming months. At this stage, though, I haven't seen it be a very compelling technique.
That's good to know. On the other side of like human aligned LM as a judge, what are some helpful code-based scores for evaluations? And can you provide some concrete examples? Do you mind if I also give one that's like pretty specific?
Yeah, please.
I've been working with a lot of different like meeting note-taking apps, and one of the things we care about is just summarization. And what we found is for a lot of the earlier models, the feedback was just that the summaries are too short, right? And so a very simple eval that we had in the beginning is just what is the character count of the initial summary divided by the character count of the total transcript. And it was basically like 22%. We were throwing up a lot of information. And it was very easy to just add a couple lines of a prompt and say, make sure that the summary length is in proportion to the length of the transcript. And it went to 35%. And then we looked at the variance of that distribution and then started prompting it in such a way where we weren't trying to improve the percentage, but just the variance of that percentage. And those are just very simple tests to write. Another one that we had was constructing action items. And our eval there was just how many of those action items were not tagged with a speaker. And so it's one thing to say that this work will be done. It's another to say this work will be done by Jason. And again, those are just very simple code-based evals. It just tells us, are we assigning people to tasks? If we're not, why? And are the summaries too dense or too sparse?
Yeah, I think so. You bring up two very good points. One is that I think people tend to initially assume that an eval is bad or a score is bad unless it's 100%. And the reality is that doesn't matter. Like really what you care about is when you run a new experiment, how does it impact a score? And so if you have a score or a heuristic like that, and it's 22% or 10% or 56% or whatever, it actually doesn't matter because really what you're trying to do is understand how changes will impact the score, not the score's absolute value. And I think that's one of the things that is really important to grasp when you're building heuristic scorers. Other examples that I think are quite useful are things like, honestly, Levenstein distance is a very popular metric among our customers. It's incredibly imperfect. One of the common use cases for Levenstein is if you're doing data extraction type stuff, like checking that entities are equal to what you expect. And Levenstein might give you like 83%, but it might actually be correct. And there's like a typo in the original document or something. That's totally fine. What matters is if you change a model, does it go from 83% to 50%, or does it go from 83% to 82% or 84%? And so it's not really a difference. The other point that you bring up is that I think code-based scores are good for basically checking. They're almost like type checkers or like checking invariants that ought to be true. So if you're building something like RAG, one of the useful things that you could check with a code-based scorer is, does the response include reference citations? Maybe that's an important part of your use case. And models, they will go awry and they will forget to reference things depending on how you actually construct the application. And that's the kind of thing, like maybe you're working on an application that shows the references in the UI, and that's a very important part of the application. You can almost like type check that will happen by using a code-based scorer.
Let's do one more question here, and then we'll just leave it up for some live questions. If everyone can just see the react button, there's like a raise hand emoji here. So if you want to just raise your hand for the rest of the questions, let's do that because I want to make sure we can get some live work. The last question is just, I think you've worked with a lot of really great companies like the Notions and the Ramps and the Stripes of the world. What do you see are the biggest like behavioral changes that they've been able to make when it comes to working with evals and working with observability? Like, what do you think makes them stand out above the rest, or what could just every team here take away?
Yeah, I think the main thing that really good companies do is they take people with great product intuition, not necessarily great data science chops. Although having good data science chops is incredibly valuable, I think there's no substitute for having good product intuition. And they get those people to stare at data and look at real examples. And I think if you get people with good product intuition to look at real examples of things going well, and you figure out how to scale that process, then that is what creates an excellent AI product. Because you want someone who has empathy for the end user to literally look with their eyeballs at what the end user is experiencing and use that intuition to improve the quality of their application. Now, when you have 3 users and a small number of engineers or whatever, you can do that without any evals or anything, right? You just run the application and you'll see things that are good and things that are bad. But when you want to scale that to many millions of users potentially using your application, you need to use something like evals as a way to, in my opinion, ultimately prioritize the time that your team spends so that they're looking at the most useful examples and building the best intuition and efficiently testing their hypotheses. And so I think, again, like the best teams embrace that idea. Vitor from Zapier just did a session with us last week, and he said he looks at traces for 3 hours a day. This is like a staff product engineer at Zapier. He's like a really talented software engineer, and he spends 3 hours a day looking at traces. And I think that mentality, and he's not just scanning through the logs, right? He's looking at the right traces, but that mentality, I think, is what it takes.
Before we go into questions, I realize this one's probably pretty relevant. Are you ready to talk about pricing at all, or should we save that for the async thing?
Yeah, what I can say is I know it's been long awaited, but we are going to release self-serve pricing pretty soon. I can't publicly announce I don't want to like preempt the team's announcement on how the pricing will work, but I think our goal is to make it very easy for people to, one, to have a really generous free plan, and two, to get started and scale as their use case scales.
Matthew, do you want to kick us off with the first live question?
Yeah, hello. This is a little bit tangential to evals, but also related and might be relevant to Braintrust. So I was just curious if you had any thoughts about optimizing prompts with, for example, DSPY. Is that something that, if you see that as a promising, is that something that you're at all considering incorporating into Braintrust as a part of running experiments?
Yes, great question. And I think what we've seen very much tracks what we've seen with human aligned scorers. I think DSPY is very exciting. I personally don't like the syntax, but I don't think that matters. It's a very cool concept, and I think it's directionally the right framing for how to create optimizable AI programs. The biggest problem that we've seen is that companies don't actually have the data sets needed to be able to take advantage of auto optimization well. And so we are planning to release a bunch of stuff, but I actually think that our primary focus is going to be helping you create a really good flywheel of data specifically for the purpose of doing auto optimization. I almost think of auto optimization as like the cherry on top once you've prepared an immaculately good data set that allows you to optimize in the first place.
Awesome. Thank you. Just one quick follow-up question. That was super helpful. So when you say, using your words, an immaculate data set, like how do you think about what that means? Is that just a purely qualitative, we think this is representative, or is there like quantitative ways of thinking about, oh, this is a really good eval data set?
Yeah, good question. I think it's both, but specifically what I think is missing from what is available today is it's not creating the initial data set, it's creating a data set, doing some kind of auto optimization, and then witnessing the ramifications of the auto optimization and using those to improve the data set further. So I think the really important thing is actually the feedback loop that allows you to continue improving the data set rather than any specific characteristic about the data set at a particular point in time. And I think those observations are inherently going to be both quantitative and qualitative.
Okay, awesome. Thank you.
Drew?
Yeah, yeah. So this is really interesting. But one question I had is, I think the different scoring mechanisms that you identified were really about correctness of the response, or like how you can identify or track correctness in your evals. But like, have you thought about incorporating this into Braintrust, or how do you all approach it in terms of integrating like customer feedback or customer satisfaction of the responses being generated into your eval data sets and capturing some of that real life feedback from customers as opposed to relying on, say, a large language model?
That's a very core part of what we do. So in Braintrust, you can create human review scores and you can populate them through the API, which people often do to capture end user feedback. And this will probably look familiar to you. Like the most common version of it is thumbs up or thumbs down. But you can also create like categorical scores. So you could say missing receipt, or I don't know, I'm just making these up, bad audio or whatever. And you can save those as labels instead, or you can save them as scores, depending on how you want to consume them. And you can also do stuff like capture free text input. And we view the problem as twofold. One, we think it's very important that it's easy to capture end user feedback so that if you're building an application and you have a thumbs up button, you can pull that into Braintrust and then maybe also run automated scores and see where they agree and disagree. That's a great way to actually improve the quality of your automated scores. And then the other thing is it's really important to have a good workflow within Braintrust for engineers, product managers, support people, subject matter experts to actually label and incrementally keep labeling and improving data. Matt, this kind of touches on what you were talking about. I think we view the work that we are doing in auto optimization to actually be an evolution of the work that we've done so far in capturing user feedback and labeling.
Okay. Sorry, I just didn't know if Drew had something else to follow up with. Uziar, am I spelling your name right?
You're on mute.
Yeah. Thanks, Ankur, for doing this. Really appreciate it, and what you built is very interesting. My question was around computer use and voice agent evaluation. We've just now deployed some computer use agents with our customers. We have some voice agents, and I'm really struggling to figure out what's like a scalable way to evaluate them. Right now, it's just a crazy manual process where we're just looking at like the instructions, we're looking at the photos, we experimented with making like GIFs and like humans looking at them. And obviously, like the end thing that happened, if there's an API on the UI, on the computer use piece, And then on the voice agent, transcription is so reductive, like it's been missing a lot, like the intonation, pauses, interruptions, etc. Would love your thoughts on these two things.
Yeah, we've done a little bit more work on the latter, like voice, than the former. And I think like a few random things that we've tried, although I think it's very Wild West at this point, to be honest with you, is sometimes I don't know what APIs you're using, but sometimes the real-time transcription models are dumber than offline transcription models. And we've seen some success doing evals where you use the smarter model offline to generate a transcript and then compare it with the real-time transcript. And excuse me, that's a great way of surfacing interesting cases where the real-time transcription system is just not as good as the offline one. Super simple things you can do, like you could do both transcriptions and then Levenshtein them, or you could use an embedding distance if they're wildly different to understand what the differences are. And then I think the other thing that we've seen is converting everything to text and then running them through a classic pipeline and then comparing the results. So let's say you're building an agent that is a voice agent and it's doing some RAG behind the scenes. You might capture the original input and then the final output from the audio interaction, and then transcribe everything and take the original transcribed text and then run it through a classic RAG pipeline and take the final output and then compare them. And again, those are two different tricks to try to find cases that may be anomalous that you can improve. For computer use, we are early into seeing anyone actually use it. So admittedly, we haven't done a lot of work here. However, I think there's two exciting directions, or it's one exciting direction, but two different companies I think that have done exciting work. One is E2B and the other is browser-based. They both have emulation methods. E2B is obviously a VM and browser-based is for browser stuff like operator style use cases. And I think you can actually express the flow of computer use through both of these methods and actually potentially automate some of the manual parts that you're doing right now. I haven't done this myself though, so I can't speak to it with a lot of firsthand insight or credibility. It's just probably what I would expect to end up working in the medium term.
Cool, yeah. Appreciate that. That's where we're at right now, is just doing the evals on the actual intention of the bot. And the actual looking at the screenshots and what it did is very manual right now. Cool, thank you.
Well, are you emulating stuff or are you doing it?
Yeah, so it's like not a headless environment. And so
Okay.
it's, yeah. But I think most likely just evals on the actual intention of the instructions that the thing produces to do should probably get us there at scale. Let's see.
Yeah. Again, I think the most important thing is when you're running evals is to find anomalies. Like
Yeah.
especially with Wild West stuff like this, if you're running an eval over 1,000 examples, really the only thing that matters is I only have time to look at 10 examples. Can this thing help me find the 10 examples that I should stare at myself or try to repro myself instead of having to look at all 1,000? And if you think of the job of writing a good eval function as helping you find those 10 examples rather than an absolute metric of quality, then it might help. It might help.
Yeah, just point it to some downstream thing that is easily findable and then go back from there. Yeah.
Sure.
That's
Yeah.
really
Yeah.
what-
Again, when you notice something is broken, you're going to want to repro it, right? And you're going to want to play with it and tweak prompts and actually mess with it. So really, your job is just to find those cases.
Yeah. Thanks.
Thank you. Amir?
Hey, Ankur. Thanks for the great presentation. I had a question about online evals. So right now, the way we have our system set up, we just have thumbs up, thumbs down, the regular stuff that everyone seems to be doing. And then, so now we're spending time not only just looking at doing offline evals, just looking at data sets and just evaluating data sets by using our eyes and like qualitatively saying, hey, this sucks, this is okay, this sucks, this is okay. But now with online, now we're looking at user feedback, also doing the exact same thing. Is there any other signals that also help? And yeah, any other strategies on improving the use of time here?
Yeah, for sure. I think I would suggest adding online scorers. You saw the scores that we created in the playground. You can actually run any of those scores directly on your logs or any of the pre-built auto eval scores directly in Braintrust. And so I think probably obvious to you, but if you have offline evals and they're reasonably good and they don't require ground truth values, for example, like the summary proportion thing Jason was talking about, or something like the coherence of a result, you can just take those exact scoring functions and run them on a sample of your logs. And then you've basically built a filter or a funnel of things that would do poorly in your evals, and you can just find them directly in your logs.
That's pretty simple. Thanks.
Yeah, I'll add to this too. It's also incredibly valuable to monitor this over time. We've had situations where we have a 70-80% factuality score. We onboard a whole new suite of customers, and all of a sudden their documents drop to 65%. And maybe initially we just see factuality drop, and then we can do further analysis to go, okay, it turns out that factuality dropped on February 4th because we actually onboarded these new customers and they uploaded PDFs, and it turns out all the PDFs are screenshots of like text. And so something's going on in this process. What's going on? And now you can go investigate and figure out, okay, it's these customers uploading these kinds of documents that now we can identify. And we could only figure this out because we just saw that factuality drop from 75 to 60 overnight. And that is generally just a very helpful way of identifying what's going on. Michael, you want to jump in?
Yeah, thanks. So I'm just thinking about the users of this, the playground and the system, and maybe you could comment on different patterns here, for example, like just looking at some very high level summaries versus drilling down like the guy you described earlier who spends 3 hours by looking at the traces. What's the typical, use case here?
Yeah, I think if you think about a healthy team of people that work on an AI application, there's a lot of different people involved. I think you tend to have some engineers, like product-oriented engineers. You tend to have some ML or data science-minded people. You tend to have product managers / designers who really care about the user experience, but are maybe less in the weeds of technical details. They also care about things like pricing. So they want to evaluate on some frequency whether you're getting the best ROI that you'd want from the models that you're using. And then you have subject matter experts like support, ops, data labelers, et cetera, who are very familiar with the problem and usually not very technical. And some of our customers, I can't quote the numbers publicly, but there are like thousands of humans at some of our customers who are using Braintrust. And part of, I think, our job is to bring all of these people together into one environment that, it actually works for different personalities. So the playground that I showed you, it's super unlikely that a product manager would create the tool that does retrieval. But once you create the tool, it's very easy for a product manager to write a RAG prompt and then actually just pull the tool in and use it and test some stuff. And so there's a lot of those little things in Braintrust that are designed to help you navigate the necessary diversity of skill sets that go into building an AI application. I'll give you a quick example. So we talked a little bit about review. So if you look at an example of an experiment like this, where you can actually save review information, this UI is generally something that like Jason would be very happy to use. And like it has all the numbers and all the stuff that Jason would want to see. If you show this to a support person, they're going to get very lost very quickly. But Braintrust has this human review UI. You just hit the R key, and then it turns into this much more simplified thing that you can actually further customize. And it's much, much easier for someone who literally just wants to look at this input and the output and the ground truth value, and then actually just label it against a rubric. And so I think we put a lot of work into bringing a bunch of different kinds of people together.
Interesting. Thank you. Yeah.
All right, let's do one question with Navneet, and then we can leave the rest in the Slack, and I'll just invite Ankur to make sure he's able to see that. Navneet, do you want to jump in?
I'm just new to Braintrust. It might sound a stupid question. I just want to ask. So in the start of this tutorial, you run an experiment, right? So are those connected to a production-ready retrievers, or is there a retriever that you specifically created in the Braintrust itself and that run those experiments?
You can do either.
So there is an API support itself where we can just call Braintrust and then they run those retrievers and we can send those experiments to the Braintrust UI itself.
That's right. Yeah.
Okay. And when we run those experiments, is there a support for comparing different retrievers like the semantic search versus the hybrid search? What works best? And is there a support for that as well?
Yeah. The idea with Braintrust is every time you run an experiment, you're trying something new. So in this case, I'm testing using RAG versus not using any retrieval at all, but it's totally arbitrary. You can just test whatever you want. And when you do that, you get a bunch of comparison metrics that you can use to actually dig in and understand. It's surprising that without using RAG, there's still 9 regressions. So this is basically saying I'm using RAG, but the answers are worse with using RAG compared to not using any RAG. And yeah, that's the whole point of Braintrust.
Great. I don't think we have any more live questions. Ankur, there's a bunch of other questions in the Slido, but I'll let you take a look and see if there's any questions that you think would be helpful for the whole team. And yeah, I think on behalf of everyone, thank you so much for taking your time to share this with us. Big fan of the work that you're doing. And yeah, I think that's it for everyone. We'll let some thank you messages stream into the chat. And yeah, we'll see you guys on Slack.
Awesome. All right, great. Thanks, everyone. Good to meet you.